For more on this, let's now speak to Emma van der Walt. She's the founder and CEO of Brave to Love nonprofit organization. Emma, very good afternoon to you. Of course, this is a highly anticipated sentencing, and I'm sure many South Africans will be watching keenly from tomorrow to see how things will unfold for the accused. But it is rather a bittersweet, for a lack of a better phrase, and worrying, as we've heard in that report, that to date the whereabouts of little Joshlin are unknown. What for you is important at this stage of the trial?
Yeah, I think it's a very unique case within the context of South Africa because of the child not being found yet, because the child is still missing. But I think it's very important for South Africa that when we look at human traffic cases, we look at international, and we can look also in the context of South Africa. So we know on international scale, most of the cases on child trafficking, the child is trafficked by someone that they are familiar with. So it's not just a stranger that suddenly walk past and kidnap, although those cases do come to the front. But in this case, it's usually someone that is familiar. In the context of South Africa, we do see a lot of the communities where there's a high use of drugs, there's drug abuse. We see the child ending up as the victims. We see the child ending up as the victims of a community. And this is quite serious for us. So we also see that we have cases where mothers have sold their babies for drug debt, where they own the drug dealer's money, and there's a transaction and that child just disappears. So there's different reasons. We can't always establish with investigations what happens to the child. We know in South Africa, yes, we do have children that are trafficked for multi purposes. We also, but a large group of the children are trafficked into the sex trade. The challenge with this case is also because it's a border post, Saldanha Bay. We know the influx and outflux of people being smuggled in and out of our ports of entry, which is a concern. And is this child smuggled to possibly to South America or somewhere else, or if the child does not exist because the case got so, did the child pass away? Was the child murdered? We've seen in child rape cases where a child is raped, a lot of time the predator wants to hide the evidence, and then unfortunately the child is murdered in the same place. So we do have hope. We will continue, but this is a serious case, and many of our other cases show that a lot of times the mothers are involved with the trafficking because or someone that the child is already trusted with, that the child is trusting or familiar with the child.
And you speak about, the unusual circumstances of, going to trial with her still being missing in the country. I want to talk about something else that had happened in this case that was rather unusual, but also very encouraging. Residents of the Middle Pass informal settlement are now calling for the maximum sentence to be imposed. While the entire country has been gripped by this case, it also is the community's outrage that has also made this particular case so high profile, even resulting in the case being moved closer to Saldanha, where essentially the judiciary thought it would be fit to bring justice to the people. How significant and important do you think that was, particularly as community members are now being more vigilant?
And I think this is important because 1 out of 10 cases of human trafficking are actually identified. And the case with Joshlin, what we as NGOs working with human trafficking are asking, and to prevent trafficking on more children from being trafficked, we're asking the following questions. Why wasn't this child identified as a high-risk child in a community? Meaning our schools, we call upon the government so that every school in South Africa will have social workers to assist with workers. We know the community of Saldanha Bay, if you actually go research, there's only 17 full-time police officials. Why are we not strengthening these communities with enough law enforcement officers, enough social workers, and trained teachers and the community to be able to identify high-risk areas for child trafficking and child sexual exploitation? And I think that is key, because if this child was identified, prevented before the case actually happened, growing up, the girl growing up with a mother that is a drug addict. Drugs, we know the effect of drugs makes you obviously lose a lot of weight. That's why she's picking up weight. We also see that it makes you not you're making decisions out of your norm, but it's criminal act, and we know the gangsterism in the area. And the last thing I'll say on this is I've seen it over and over. Once a child is trafficked in a community, the whole community is traumatized. The effect of the trauma of a child being trafficked does affect the entire community. And this is so important, this case, so that we voice and speak out against human trafficking. But the key is to identify vulnerable communities and vulnerable children within schools, so that we can, where their guardians are not protecting them safely, so that we can interact before that child is trafficked.
Emma, before we wrap our conversation, I want to actually pick up on a point that you made earlier. And that, of course, speaks to the kind of trends that we are seeing now. You know, kidnapping cases in the country are quite alarming. When it comes to children, especially the numbers, when you look at 2023, 2024, they show an increase of 11% from the previous year. What does the rise in these cases tell us about violence against children, particularly when you talk about family members being involved? Because, I mean, in the trial, we heard that she was sold at one point to a sangoma for 20,000 rand, and that, there was collusion in terms of who will be paid how much in this whole sale of this little child. And we still don't have the clear answers to that.
Yes, and I think important, once again, I want to address the substance abuse, the effect of substance abuse in the communities. We know of children that are vulnerable, that are targeted by gangs, are recruited in these gangs and sell drugs, which is a form of trafficking, because a child cannot give consent to, and they are forced to sell drugs, which is forced into criminality. So we see the vulnerability of these children. The stats are higher, so there's two sides to look at it. We can either say the community and law enforcement are becoming better in identifying cases, and I do think that is part of it. We know that there's a lot of training within law enforcement that are able to identify these vulnerable groups, and social workers. We are involved very close with the Department of Social Development, and I know they've got good teams on that are trained in human trafficking. So that's the one side. But yes, we are concerned. A lot of children are born in our country that are undocumented. It makes them vulnerable. They don't have, the birth was never documented. We know in some of these gangs area where there's specifically where mothers that are on substance abuse, the child is not born in a hospital. That child is not documented, which makes them more vulnerable to be sold, because where you'll never have, you don't know where the child is. And our borders, once again, I emphasize our borders, the in and out of the influx of illegal immigrants. Those children are also vulnerable because they are not documented. We don't know that the child is actually in South Africa. And also the ports of exit. We know there are people being trafficked outside to other areas, and the missing children in our country, our stats are too high. Yes.
Emma, thank you so much for your words. Of course, we will be closely monitoring those developments then starting tomorrow. Emma van der Walt is the founder and CEO of Brave to Love, a non-profit organization here in the country. Of course, tomorrow the sentencing proceedings will be beginning in this matter. The Kelly Smith, Jacqueline Apollos and Saldanha van Ryn are the accused. Of course, the judge has set aside 3 days for the matter to be heard.